How do you harmonize a melody? Suppose we have a naked melody and we want to dress it up with some chords. There is no right or wrong way. We could say there are stronger and weaker choices, though. At minimum, every choice will have an effect, and predicting those effects is the key to crafting reliably successful chord progressions. It's worth noting that harmonizing a melody is a slightly different process than composing a chord progression on its own. If we were just writing a chord progression from scratch, we would have the freedom to move any harmonic direction we desire. With a given melody, we're obligated to choose chords that support those notes. Let's practice with a familiar song, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Here's the melody by itself. We'll begin with a bare minimum chord progression. By this, I mean we will only draw from the primary diatonic triads, the 1, 4, and 5 chords. We'll only change harmony when necessary, and we'll start with the most obvious choices. From there, we'll systematically expand to more advanced variations. Although this first harmonization will be simple, that's not to say it'll be bad or boring. Remember, we're only dealing with cause and effect. A minimalist or rudimentary chord progression will have a certain effect, one that is simply different from, not necessarily inferior to, a complex or sophisticated progression. So, which chord should we start with? Let's look at the first measure. The mediant and the tonic fall on the on beats, and the supertonic is behaving as a passing tone on the off beats. The most fundamental choice, then, is to use the primary diatonic triad that contains these two highlighted notes, i.e., the 1 chord. This casts the mediant as the third of the chord and the tonic as the root. The supertonic remains a passing tone. Looking forward, the minimalist approach would be to avoid changing harmony until necessary. In measure 2, there's no need to change from the 1 chord. In measure 3, however, the supertonic is featured. While we could keep the 1 chord, because technically you can do whatever you want, that would give us an emphasized non-chord tone, which is not exactly rudimentary. Therefore, here is where we are compelled to change chords. Measure 3 is just the supertonic. The only primary diatonic triad that contains this note is the 5 chord, so we'll go ahead and use it, making this note the 5th of our chord. 2 of the notes in measure 4 are the dominant, which would work great as the root of our dominant triad if we kept it. But the mediant would end up functioning as some awkward non-chord tone. For this reason, let's change the harmony. Given these 2 notes, we'll use the 1 chord again. Measures 5 and 6 are a near copy of measures 1 and 2, with only an additional instance of the 3rd scale degree, so we can stay on our tonic triad. Measure 7 is an echo of measure 3, with a slight embellishment. The mediant shows up. It does fall on an on beat, but it's behaving as a neighbor tone. It's also outnumbered 3-1 by the supertonic, and the supertonic has the downbeat. In this case, the supertonic wins and the 5 chord returns. This makes the mediant a mere accented neighbor tone. Somewhat bold, but still fairly ordinary. Measure 8 comes to rest on the tonic scale degree. Both the 1 chord and the 4 chord would work, but all other factors aside, and that's a huge caveat, the ear tends to assume a note is the root of a chord rather than some other chord member. Plus, we are at the end of the piece. Melodically, we resolve, so harmonically we kinda want the same. The obvious choice here is to use the tonic triad. Alrighty, let's listen to this harmonization. That sounds perfectly fine. And it's most likely the chord progression one would use for this piece. It is a nursery rhyme, after all. But now that we've done the basic version, we can start to explore. One move we can make is to utilize other diatonic triads. This will add some variety and perhaps momentum to the harmonic progression. There is one primary diatonic triad we haven't used yet, the 4 chord. The challenge, though, is there's no obvious place to put it. 2 of its chord tones, the subdominant and the submediant, never appear. So if we want to avoid creating colorful non-chord tones in the melody, we'd have to use it when the tonic scale degree is the focus. The only place this happens is at the end, at least when working at the mensural level, but put a pin in that. Considering this measure alone, that's a decent choice, but ending on the subdominant chord will leave the listener hanging, so let's hold off on that for the moment. The question now arises, how frequent should our chord changes be? This is subjective. Again, it just goes back to cause and effect, if then. We started with only necessary changes. The next step would be to change at natural indentations in the melody. These are often found at downbeats and at the beginnings of melodic phrases. These two tend to coincide. Given what we have so far, the only empty spots are at the downbeats of measure 2 and measure 6. Both contain only the mediant. Since we've already used the 1 chord and the other 2 primary diatonic triads don't have this note, it's time to bring in the auxiliary diatonic triads. The 2 auxiliary chord options are the minor 3 and the minor 6. The 6 has a definitive tonic function, while the function of the 3 is a bit ambiguous. If our goal is to remain straightforward, these measures will go to the 6. If you want to add a bit more harmonic interest, we could use the 3 in one or both measures. If we use it once, the logical choice would be in measure 6 instead of measure 2. This way we save the object of greater interest for later, a common and effective method of composition. To push the harmonic interest even further, we could eliminate a couple redundancies. The second dominant chord can be replaced by its auxiliary, the diminished 7. Again, we could have swapped out the first 5 chord, but saving the juicier stuff for later is often wise, and that 7 is quite juicy. We could also exchange the tonic triad in measure 5 for its auxiliary, the minor 6. We'll have already heard it in this progression, but it will have been applied to a different part of the melody. Here, it'll take on a slightly different character and therefore feel fresh. While we're having fun, why not bring in that subdominant triad at the end? We balked at this idea earlier, but things are starting to heat up, so why not live dangerously? At this point, the only diatonic triad we haven't found a place for is the 2. Poor guy. It would need to go in measure 3 or measure 7. Honestly, that 7 chord is a bit rich for my blood, so I'm going to swap it out for the 2. It's not an auxiliary to the 5, but the 2 has subdominant function, as it's an auxiliary to the 4, so it'll help justify this unconventional ending. Now we have a much more interesting chord progression. Still, in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty tame. Diatonic triads and root position that change on downbeats and conform to the melody aren't going to make anyone's head spin. Again, there's nothing wrong with this. In fact, simplicity is beautiful and, in some ways, more challenging to master. Nevertheless, let's carry onward for the sake of exploration and adventure. We might be tempted to go outside the key at this juncture, but let's not be so hasty. There are still more paths we can take to intensify the harmony while staying diatonic. Inversions are in a bit of a gray area when it comes to harmonization. The difference between C and C over E, for example, is more a matter of voicing. They are essentially the same chord, but putting a chord tone other than the root in the bass does change the chord's feeling and impact enough to warrant discussion in a lesson on harmonization. There are basically two angles to consider: the effect of any individual bass note and the behavior of a bass line through a series of chords. We might start in root position to establish a firm connection to the key and the opening chord. Then we could put our second chord, the minor 6, in first inversion. This softens the transition into that chord and dims its presence. It also hints at a pedal point in the bass. We could put the following 5 chord in first inversion as well, and then return to the tonic in root position. This reins in the bass line, giving it only a tiny half-step move in the third measure. Now the first half will feel more narrow, controlled, and smooth. In bar 5, let's go to root position on the 6 so it lands with more gravitas than before, mirroring the confidence of the opening chord and decidedly kicking off the second half. Then, why not mimic the progression above by putting the next 2 chords in buoyant first inversion? We'll also end up with a nice walk down in the bass, creating a subtle counter melody. At the end, let's confound the issue further by putting the 4 chord in second inversion. This is a defiant position for any chord, and here it leans toward impudent, given the lack of resolution in the harmony. On the other hand, maybe it's deferential, given that the tonic of the key will be in the bass. Now, the bass and the melody will obediently resolve, but the surrounding harmony will remain suspended in a musical limbo. While we're on bass notes, we must acknowledge the use of non-chord tones in the bass. There are 2 kinds: embellishing non-chord tones and structural non-chord tones. In practice, these 2 can overlap. Embellishing non-chord tones aren't considered part of the main harmonic structure. Rather, they are adornments, accessories. Although they're a bit tangential to the topic at hand, they do help shape the harmonic experience, so they're worth mentioning. There are a slate of traditional melodic non-chord tones we could draw from: neighbor tones, passing tones, anticipations, suspensions, retardations, escape tones, appoggiaturas, and pedal points. Because the bass line is a melody in its own right, any of these can be applied to the bass. Let's try a few. A neighbor tone can go in measure 1, in parallel harmony to the melody. An anticipation before measure 3 will give the listener a nice jolt, and it'll play nicely off the break in the melody. We can use an escape tone on the upbeat of measure 5. It'll create a moment of harmony with the melody and liven up the descending bass line. Let's try a suspension going into measure 7, just to keep our listeners on their toes. It'll also tie nicely into this next addition. Let's add a walk down, i.e. passing tones, in the bass in measure 4 and in measure 7. These stepwise passages pull like smooth taffy through the piece. Stepping down to the root of the 6 chord in bar 5 and to the tonic of the key in bar 8 helps bring out the tonicization happening on those downbeats. It also emphasizes the beginning of the second phrase and the end of the melody, 2 pivotal moments. Specifically, putting the walk down on the upbeat of measure 4 creates another moment of rhythmic interplay between the melody and the bass. The cherry on top, though, is the doubling that now occurs with the last 3 notes of the melody. To make sure we sufficiently gild this lily, let's add a few more chords over a pedal point at the end. Hey, at least we resolved the progression. Structural non-chord tones in the bass, also known as non-harmonic bass notes, are much more tricky to pull off. Because the bass has such a powerful influence on the identity of a chord, a non-chord tone in the bass often just reframes the upper structure, casting itself as a chord tone of some unintended harmony. When we do manage to create a genuine non-harmonic bass note, it is often quite pungent and destabilizing. To achieve non-harmonic bass notes, we usually must go against convention and expectation. The reason is because if we do something logical or familiar, we'll most likely end up with a reharmonization and/or an embellishment rather than a true non-harmonic bass note. For this same reason, they often defy standard theoretical analysis and function. Here is an example. Up to now, we've been assuming a major tonality. However, we could easily shift to another tonality. Take the relative minor, for example. We'll have the same set of triads, but their functions will change. Here's a fairly straightforward iteration using natural minor and following the same guidelines from before. For a bit more adventure, we could try another mode, such as Lydian. This melody isn't exactly suited for the relative Lydian. We'll end up with some pretty rich sounds, and I'm saving those for later. But we could use the parallel Lydian key, because the fourth scale degree doesn't appear in the melody. Therefore, we wouldn't need to alter the tune to make it Lydian. I'm avoiding altering any melody notes because that goes beyond pure harmonization. Here's a take in Lydian. It's a bit unusual, but it has its merits. Perhaps we're starting to feel these plain triads are too simplistic and need a little sprucing up. Suspending and adding tones are two ways to breathe new life into hackneyed chords. A suspended fourth chord, in the most conventional sense, provides a bit of tonal dissonance as we expect that fourth to ultimately resolve to the third of our given chord. A suspended second chord works much the same way, but the dissonance is more mellow and the resolve is more uplifting. Simply adding the second or fourth, rather than suspending them, eliminates the expectation of a resolution and increases the dissonance, making the chord more rich in flavor. Because the second doesn't create as much tonal pull as the fourth, an added second sounds fairly stable, while an added fourth generates internal conflict. We should also acknowledge chromatically altered added notes. They can be quite spicy, but the raised fourth tends to be one of the most palatable because allusions to Lydian are not uncommon. An added sixth is chummy and has the air of a seventh chord. When applied to a minor triad, though, it's less chummy and more sly. Nevertheless, it adds a bit of light to the dark demeanor of a plain minor triad. A fourth added to a minor triad is more soft, less biting than it is in a major triad. An added second, however, draws out the claws of a minor triad, given its proximity to the lowered third. This next version modifies every triad. We have one of each suspended chord and a variety of added tone chords. This many modified chords is probably overkill. In practice, they tend to be used more judiciously. Seventh chords and their extensions bring sophistication, depth, and intrigue. They add dimensions to the harmony. I should note that sixth chords, or added sixth chords, often get lumped in with seventh chords given how they behave. When working with seventh chords and extensions, the principle is still the same. We generally conform to the focal points in the melody. With triads, we're bound to roots, thirds, and fifths. Seventh chords and extensions allow us to explore higher levels of harmony. The further away from the root we take the listener, the more challenging and complex the sound. Anchoring the melody at the third or fifth is like building a townhouse. Hitching it to the 11th or 13th is like constructing a harmonic skyscraper. Each has its benefits and drawbacks. Here is a version utilizing seventh chords, but avoiding overt extensions in the melody. This still follows the approach we started with. Identify the essential notes of the melody and cast them as chord tones. But now we have sevenths everywhere, both in the harmony and in the melody. It's as if our chords are now wearing suits and dresses. What happens if we incorporate extensions? Now, our chords are in tuxedos and evening gowns. We've gone about as far as we can go inside the given key. Sure, we've experimented with some chromaticism via added notes and extensions, but every chord so far has been diatonic. It's time to start branching out and seeing what our neighboring musical galaxies can offer. Secondary chords, more specifically secondary dominants, are designed to tonicize a scale degree other than the tonic. These can add a more potent and provocative tension and release than our primary dominant can achieve. Combining this technique with seventh chords and extensions makes for a rather dramatic and ornate progression. We can also borrow chords from a parallel key. Borrowing, also known as modal interchange, is typically done between parallel major and minor keys. This piece is in major, so let's invite some chords from our parallel minor. It's a little tricky considering how prevalent the mediant is, but we'll do our best. That was a bit excessive, but you get the idea. Keep in mind, as with many of these techniques, a little goes a long way. The last tool in this kit is rhythm. The frequency and regularity with which the chords change is its own subplot in the musical story. Changing chords more frequently will increase the momentum of the piece. Syncopated or irregular chord changes shift the harmonic landscape unexpectedly, thereby creating a more adventurous journey and increasing the rhythmic tension. And with that, we have harmonized the hell out of Mary Had a Little Lamb. I hope you enjoyed this expedition. Happy harmonizing! Until next time.